Thank you, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you had a really enjoyable afternoon tea and that the various concurrent sessions that you attended were as inspiring as the panel session we heard before the break, and that you've come back in ready for the home straight into our evening sessions later on. You'll see that there are now two translators beside me. One is Auslan and one is international. In case you're wondering, there are two different forms of language that are being interpreted here, which is wonderful for our guests. So we have a final really great session to present with you this afternoon. It's the first time we've done this at an ACFID conference. These are known as lightning talks. So it puts a lot of pressure on the speaker, and then the speaker becomes the interviewer of the speaker in a rapid fire set of questions to follow up from the presentation. So you're going to hear from, after me, you're going to hear from three people who are each going to speak to us for no more than 8 minutes, and then they will join the last person on the seats over here for a 3-minute Q&A. Sometimes it'll be 2 questions, maybe 3, but these are rapid-fire responses. So the whole thing happens very quickly, but we hope to get a lot of fantastic information out of the session. We've tried to work out how to do these things better and better every year, and so in light of the discussions we've been having today, we're very enthusiastic about the speakers you're going to hear from now. As you've been finding, organisations are increasingly challenged by the entry of new actors and the shifting dynamics of power and influence. Our current business models and ways of working will need to be continually evaluated as the ecosystem around us evolves. So in this rapid fire session, we're going to hear some provocative thoughts on our next steps together around the space for civil society, transformational ways of working towards impact at scale, collective impact, and systems approaches to community empowerment, big data and digitisation. So we're trying to do a lot in a very quick rapid fire method, so I hope you enjoy it. Our first speaker to talk on enabling environments for transformation in Australian organisations is our ACFID CEO, Marc Purcell. Marc.
Thanks, Sam. I'm actually going to talk about the threats of a disabling environment for charities and NGOs in Australia. There are 3 current threats to advocacy undertaken by Australian non-government organisations. The first is a potential ban on international philanthropy to organisations that advocate. What type of advocacy? I'm talking about the Campaign for Australian Aid, which Tim and I co-chair and many of you are members of, which works on the electoral cycle to try and leverage each major political party to increase the level of Australian aid. Secondly, the type of work that Save the Children is doing, taking politicians out to the field, bringing them back, exposing them to Australian NGO projects, and then bringing them back to Australia to talk about it in Parliament and to their constituencies in the public. So the second challenge is a proposal to cap advocacy under tax-deductible status that has been floated in a Treasury discussion paper. And the third challenge is to the independence of our national charities regulator, the Australian Charities Not-for-Profit Commission. Let me explain. So with international philanthropy, it's under threat because the government is moving with justification to ban political donations to political parties and politicians. You all remember the incidents of politicians having bills paid by overseas businesses and the like. And so there is a public interest in this occurring. However, they want to capture all entities. And so in the conversations we've been having with government, they're saying that they're going to bring the ban in and NGOs and their advocacy will be included. Underneath this, we think is a concern about the activism and advocacy of some NGOs that you heard from earlier today in the previous plenary session, and the government wants to shut this down. So they're going to bring in this bill probably in the November-December sitting this year of Parliament, and we're very, very concerned, and we have been advocating in an alliance with Philanthropy Australia, Community Council of Australia, many other organisations, to push back on this and say international philanthropy should not be constrained for legitimate advocacy purposes by charities in Australia. That's within their purpose. Secondly, the Treasury discussion paper that came out on tax-deductible status for a number of different sectors, including our own aid and development sector this year, floated suggestions such as capping the amount of advocacy that could be undertaken with tax-deductible funds. What became apparent later on is that the Minerals Council of Australia have also been urging the government to take this position, and Barnaby Joyce went to the Minerals Council of Australia national conference earlier this year in August and actually argued that charities undertaking advocacy should be stopped. Finally, the charities regulator, there was great concern earlier this year when against the advice of the board of the charities regulator and also the commissioner was not reappointed to that role. So now there is a recruitment process occurring, but 150 charities have signed an open letter to the government calling for the independence of the charity regulator to be respected and for a transparent process to be employed in appointing a new regulator, because we're worried that in the case of other regulators in other jurisdictions like Canada, they have actually, under certain types of government, been used to shut down advocacy by NGOs. I'll end there. Thank you.
So Marc has actually done it in record time. He's given us a couple extra minutes for the questions, perhaps. So I have two questions for you, Marc. The first is a bit of a two-pronged one. What happens if ACFID members just sit this one out? And can you explain a little bit about the impact this is going to have beyond just environmental NGOs? Does it affect others in the sector?
Well, this morning, for those of you that were at our AGM, you would have heard from Marie Nutt from Results. Results are a really important, well-known organisation in our sector that actually work with volunteers to go around and lobby on international health issues and lobby politicians, both in their electorate and up in Parliament. They've been doing that very successfully for many years. They're held in very high regard up on the Hill. But, ironically, they are supported in part through international philanthropy. And if this ban goes ahead and actually tries to shut down philanthropy for advocacy purposes, that will have a big hit on organisations like Results in our sector. It will have a big hit on the Campaign for Australian Aid, which has received very generous funding from the Gates Foundation. So it's not just about other sectors being in the gun sights of some politicians. If there's an attack on one and measures are brought in, it can affect everybody. It might be the environment sector this year, but next year it could be the human rights sector or Indigenous sector, whoever is offside with the government of the day. So it's very important that we reasonably but strongly push back on these measures.
So essentially ACFID will not sit this one out, and you'll be hearing more from you and the team and expectations around the sector for lots of advocacy around this. Great. My second question is, how can our members find out what they can do legitimately on advocacy and campaigning in the environment we're in?
Yeah, I think the important thing to understand is advocacy is absolutely legitimate under your charitable purpose. And it's important that we advocate these days. We don't just have soup kitchens. We actually go and look at why are there people homeless? What are policies that government should bring in to prevent homelessness? So as long as you're operating within your charitable purpose, advocacy can be integral to your purpose. And if you go to the website of the Australian Charities Not-for-Profit Commission, there's excellent resources there that actually provide guidance on what is legitimate for advocacy. The main thing is you're not allowed to be partisan. So you're not allowed to back a political party or a political candidate, but you can absolutely advocate and campaign on an issue that is consistent with your purpose. So I really encourage you to look on that website and use those resources during the election campaign.
Thanks, Marc. Quick round of applause for Marc. And now I'm going to hand over to Marc to introduce the next speaker.
Gilbert, come on up. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you all, or reintroduce you for some of you to Gilbert Kamanga. Can you correct me, Gilbert, please? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I've done very well.
Thank you. Good. Gilbert is National Director of World Vision Uganda, and he's going to be sharing lessons on transformational ways of working for impact at scale from the refugee crisis in South Sudan. Welcome, Gilbert. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody. Why did I agree or choose to speak about this is because, one, World Vision Uganda, less than 14 months ago, was responding to about 160,000 refugees, but today we are responding to over 1.3 million refugees from South Sudan. So that meant we went expanding our operation to exponential growth. That's why I felt it's necessary for us to share what happened for us in Uganda to come to that level. Just to mention that refugees in Uganda are not in camps, they are in settlements. Refugees are given pieces of land where they settle, so that if you go there 6 months after, you may think they're just part of like any other village. Secondly, also to know about Uganda refugees, that the government of Uganda is one of the few governments where the refugees are within their national development policy. And they are advocating for what they call a refugee and host population empowerment framework. That means 30% of the services you give to the refugee settlements should be for the host populations. That is easier to say than to do. The third and the last one, which I want to talk about, the fact that in refugee situation in Uganda, we have the comprehensive refugee framework, which is a part of the global agreements, which is again on paper, but funding is a challenge. Highlight to say that the refugees in Uganda, I would say 51% of all refugees in South Sudan are in Uganda, and that of that, you can see that 61% are children. So, how did World Vision Uganda do this? We basically, as the National Director, focus on 3 insights, which I want to share with you. One is the aspect that I looked at connections. Connection number 1 was the fact that the type of crisis, it is a children's crisis. Secondly, is an issue of solutions. The idea is that the traditional solutions could not hold any further. The third one is priorities. We needed to move from just basic life savings to long-term programming immediately. And thirdly was an issue of partnerships. The second aspect of insight, which we focus on in Uganda, was an issue of systems leadership. That it meant that as a leader, I need to move at looking at opportunities for synergy, and also ensuring that I shift from compliance to commitment, and also to ensure that staff on the front line are given responsibility to make decisions as they go. And the last one also, the issue that coordination and control mechanism was based on shared goals and on a sense of purpose. The third insight which we focused on in Uganda was the aspect of communication and advocacy. In order for us in Uganda to achieve all this, or not just by our own, as World Vision alone, we had partners. Therefore, looking at creating social movement and building networks was critical, and also ensuring that connecting people's values and motivation, and also networks for social movement and community action was at the center of our work. That ensured that we had people who came from different locations, including here in Australia, came and supported us. So, what am I saying to us here today? One, as development actors, we need to make sure that we make a shift from power to where action is taking place. World Vision benefited from that aspect, that we were able to allow to do something meaningful because we were given the responsibility to do so. Secondly, we need to have a sense of active engagement with each other. Acting solo may not be the solution. Thirdly, we need to broaden the horizon. Here, for example, I know we talk about Pacific, yes, it's our proximity, but there's also more need and more opportunities across the horizon. We need to focus on data. We're able to engage people by working with the UNHCR and other UN agencies by providing the data. We need keeping communities and partners engaged, but also need to create a shared sense of purpose, which will create compelling results. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert. Come and sit down. So, Gilbert, could you tell us what has been the most satisfying thing or experience that you've had in working in this type of emergency response with the Sudanese?
One is aspect that when you see the need and the size of the need from people crossing, 3,000 refugees crossing every day, seeing that you're able to provide hope, you're able to provide some sustenance for them, to me, and you see the children who have walked miles and miles, or kilometers and kilometers, they come and have a first good shelter. To me, it was one of the most satisfying things.
And from your experience, what would you advise a leader of an organisation that wants to achieve impact at scale, working in this type of environment? What lessons do you take, and what would you advise others in our sector?
For me, my main point of emphasis is that aspect of not focusing on compliance, but on commitment. That does not mean you float all the processes and procedures, but that you allow people to make decisions as they go, but also you allow to hold them accountable at the end of it, because if you restrict them, then you will not be able to reach impact at a larger scale.
And Gilbert, can you tell us just briefly, what's the current situation as you left Uganda for the South Sudan and for the refugees, just briefly?
At the moment, we have a situation where the population keeps on increasing. Yes, we are receiving less than we are receiving before. As I said, we are receiving 3,000 refugees a day. Now they're about 300, 400. The numbers look smaller, but they're still huge. The challenge is that the host population are looking that they should also be supported, and they are not. So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two is the aspect that the refugees, when they leave their countries, they are running from hunger, from insecurity, and they want to have a place of hope. When they come to Uganda, yes, they have peace, they have food, but the element of hope is still lacking, because most of the young people don't have a lot of things to do. So we still have shortfall for funding for young people's programming. Therefore, we are running a risk that we may not create hopeful generations to come.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Gilbert Kamanga.
Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Sandra, who will talk to us. Maybe let me just say, Sandra is already here. So Sandra, please, over to you, so don't take your minutes away.
Thank you, Gilbert. My name's Sandra Robinson. I'm the CEO of Together SA. I'm going to talk to you about collective impact, which is a relatively new social change framework for Australia. I've heard the words collective impact used a lot today. Collective impact is embedded in a lot of work that we do across Australia in the social sector, and the international development sector is new to me, and I've learned a lot about that today. A collective impact as a rigorous social change framework was evolved in America about a decade ago, and in Australia probably around 7 years ago it started to take hold. There are now around 80 collective impact initiatives across the country and in South Australia. I'll go into some more detail in a minute about that. This is the official definition of collective impact. Unusual suspects at a table, sharing a common agenda for social change focused on complex social problems such as poverty, unemployment, child notification rates, obesity, and it's incredibly challenging. You can imagine a table where there are state government representatives, local government, a not-for-profit sector, community members themselves, business representatives, coming up with a shared agenda and then working differently to achieve that. It's a tricky, difficult, long-term way of working. It relies very heavily on system change, but I believe before that is culture change. When you think about the reduction of poverty in Australia, there's a lot of culture change that needs to shift in the way we think about that. Collective impact relies on collaboration, but it's not simple collaboration, it's significantly deeper partnerships. Collaboration is a spectrum. The further down to to my left that you go, the more trust with your partners you need to have. Collective impact is about integrating and embedding change to become the new normal, the new way of working. You lose more control as a partner in the work, and you need to trust more. Hence, it's challenging. There are 5 stages of collective impact. The common agenda I've already spoken about. Quite amazingly, it could take up to a year for a group of people to agree on what is it that they actually want to do and create a common agenda. Can you imagine that, going to meetings for a year to come up with a definition as simple as, we want all children 0 to 8 to thrive? It's a challenging way of working, but Einstein said, if you have an hour to solve a problem, you should put 50 minutes towards thinking about the problem and understanding it, and then the rest of the time towards coming up with the solution. That's what collective impact does. It puts the problem and understanding it first. Shared measurement. Data is essential in collective impact. The rigour of measurement and evaluation. We use population-level data, statistics about a particular community related to the shared result that we're all trying to achieve, and we also measure the outcomes from programs and services as contributions to that population-level change. We measure the collaboration itself as well. We decide what is going to work to create change. We're all looking in the same direction at the same time, changing the way we work together to create change, mutually reinforcing activities. Continuous communication and the backbone support. Together SA is called the backbone of backbones because for the initiatives across the state, we are the container for change for them. For each initiative, someone needs to keep people focused and motivated and focused on that common agenda, and that's a tricky thing to do as well. I love this picture. It shows some system mapping for obesity. So one particular collective impact initiative in South Australia wanted to look at the health of children in a particular community who had high levels of obesity. When you start to unpack that, there is no simple solution for a complex social problem. Social, physical, environmental, economic. You start mapping it, where do you begin? It's a little bit overwhelming. So this is our ambitious mission and vision. We are an organisation that is member funded. We started from contributions from both government and the not-for-profit sector. There's no other organisation like Together SA in Australia because we are solely about driving collective impact as a way of working together. I wanted to quickly show you, hopefully I'm not going to run out of time, a case study to help you understand how this plays out in reality. So the framework itself evolved into quite a different beast once people started using it. As you can imagine, it's not a linear process. Getting people to think about change is incredibly time-consuming and it takes considerable thought, research, and effort. So this particular area here is called the city of Onkaparinga. These 9 suburbs don't fit neatly into any data set, so we've had to source particular data sets from a variety of sources for them. Some data came out about 3.5 years ago that showed that the children in this area were the most vulnerable in the state, second only to the APY lands. It was a real shock for this particular community. It motivated them to get together. 30 partners committed at the time, and they are still there today. 3 years later, they finally landed somewhere with a result, with a plan. In South Australia, we use results-based accountability to align with the framework of collective impact to bring real rigour to our planning. We use indicators of the conditions of wellbeing that they choose, and we work with them to create a plan for making change in the areas that they have targeted. They come up with a governance structure. Because if you think about the service mapping and the culture change that needs to happen, you really need some solid governance around it. So there are community members in every level of governance. There's an MP, there's local councillors, not-for-profits, unusual suspects and usual suspects at the table, putting aside their own personal agendas, focusing on the main agenda. That's not an easy thing to maintain. Politics, state election coming up, people moving in and out of the work, an individual from an organisation being committed but actually not an organisation itself. So there are many challenges to this. A governance structure is one of the things that helps to keep them on track. So what are we up to? Oh, good, I'm doing it right for time. Sorry if I'm talking fast. When I accepted the invitation to speak, I don't think anyone has ever explained collective impact in 8 minutes, and it's taken me a long time to prepare it, so I do apologise if I'm speaking fast. So, collective impact. We start with many different partners, and we think about how can we take responsibility for using our resources better, because despite our best efforts, there are still children in the communities who are at incredible disadvantage. They start life with a very difficult scenario. We need to look at how can we change the framework that sits around them. How can we support their family, to support the community, to change the data in somewhere like the city of Onkaparinga. It's fraught. You can work it out. We want to achieve for 0 to 8-year-olds that they are safe, healthy, ready for today. But once you start on that journey, there are so many things that come along that are incredibly challenging. So the rigour of collective impact helps you guide that process. Long-term change. If you can think about the international development sector, what are the barriers to change? Clearly, there's a lot of intelligent people in the room who are contributing an awful lot to this area. But why is there still a need? Why does the data tell us that there is still a need? How can we work differently? Because when the community are ready for us to create that change. So I can't believe I haven't gone over my 8 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. Would you just give us one example, just an issue of emphasis of community mobilization in a collective impact initiative?
Yes.
Just one example.
So on, yeah. So community mobilisation is an essential piece for collective impact. People with lived experience and local people having a voice in the conversations. The word empowerment, I'm not so comfortable with, because I think that communities are already empowered. What they need is an opportunity. They need us to change how we are working so we can provide access to those opportunities to contribute. One I'd like to share with you is together in the south, in the city of Onkaparinga. We worked with that community for a long time. We found a small group of community members who wanted to participate to create change. They trained a small group of community members who also trained a small group of community members, and so on, until we had 23 different community members who were the leaders of engagement. So when we were looking at a particular issue, one comes to mind is around playgroups. They would go out and into their networks and communicate with other community members to understand the complex social issue and bring that information back. One of the things that we found through that particular issue was that we needed the state government to shift how they were doing some of their funding of local programs in the area. Together as they led some work on that, and we were able to create some system change with how the Department for Communities and Social Inclusion funded their local programs. So that's one example.
Yeah, okay, on that one, in general, what would you say is the biggest challenges for collective impact initiatives?
I think that people want change, but people don't want to change, and I mean that when you get down to it, if you need to do something differently, and it's something that you're not used to, there's a challenge there. There's a culture shift that needs to happen. That's really challenging for people. I think that funding is an issue. The systems that have existed for a very long time. There's so many barriers to collective impact.
So, taking that into account, then what do you think should be done in order to ensure that collective initiative grows in Australia?
I think that the reason why in South Australia there are 12 collective impact initiatives now, I think the reason is that people are frustrated. They continue to be frustrated with the status quo. It's not all right that that there are children and people living in disadvantage. We need to work differently. So there's optimism, there's hope, and there's always energy for this work, and despite the barriers.
Thank you. Join me in thanking Sandra, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to introduce the final speaker, Katrina Dulanovic, who is KPMG's Associate Director for Analytics and Information Management, speaking today on the transformational power of big data.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm really honoured to be here today to talk to you a little bit about big data. For any of the technology people in the room, I am definitely not going to talk to you about a little yellow elephant that everybody refers to when they talk about big data. I'm going to try and talk about what big data, or data in general, means to us, our world, both society and private sector as well, and how we can leverage that and move further along. As we know, as a world in general, we collect a lot of data. We've all got devices here today, and we've posted a lot of megabytes of data across our sites. 80% of the world data is in unstructured form, in documents, in emails, and so forth. And the volume of data that we do share every day is growing immensely. It's predicted that by 2020, which is only 3 years away, we're going to have about 50 billion devices connected to the internet, in addition to what we have today. And those devices will be producing more and more data that we can harness, hopefully. So what? We get all this data. Organisations are looking at how do we harness that information? How do we transform our organisations, both socioeconomically and private sector, to improve the way we do our business, to remain competitive, to remain important, to remain and gain profitability from what we do. As part of that, the big challenge that they are finding is being able to trust that data that's flowing really quickly, and that is what their focus is. Oops. Sorry, haven't practiced using this. So what is big data? Well, big data is all the data we have. It's not just the social media data or machine data from our gadgets or internet or digital technology. It's the data that we have in our organisation, outside of our organisation. And big data on its own doesn't really mean much. It's the way and how we use it. Technology has enabled the use of this data today. We can get the data into our organisations really quickly, but being able to consolidate it, integrate it, and be able to apply our intellect and knowledge to that data is the key to actually getting value out of that big data. To gain insights around what the world means and how the data is moving along and how we can gain value is the main enabler of using data in the world today. So big data and the realms of possibility, it's applicable across the world. We collect a lot of data, we apply some intelligence using technology and tools we have for different values, socioeconomic and business imperatives that drive the need to use this data to manage risk, to increase productivity, for better citizen services and innovation, being innovative, sharing the data across the globe. And that all leads to value, both financial and non-financial, social value as well as monetary. And that, again, leads to a connected, smarter world. across the world by sharing our data that is really freely available. We don't have to pay for it. It's there, it's available. We just have to know how to use it, how to harness it. And technology has enabled us to do that in our everyday life. So some of the use cases for big data, and they apply across every industry. And to be honest, I couldn't put all of them on the one PowerPoint, so there are some missing from the list. How they're using big data across both private and non-private sector. We deal a lot with different organisations and enabling them to harness the power of data. And some of the things we've been working with a number of organisations on, for example, in the utilities industry in New South Wales, we're working with them to be able to harness their sensor data around the pipes and water, to be able to detect water leakages across the city and be able to react and respond to emergencies. Understanding when those pipes and the data and the water leakages occur, what is in the vicinity of that leakage. Is it a hospital? Is it a school? So they can proactively provide appropriate services and water utilities to those areas. And be able to support the community by letting them know when they are planning to have major outages of water due to predictive maintenance of their services, being able to tell the consumers that in 2 weeks' time they will be out of water and services will be provided soon. So these are some of the ways that they're using this big data in being able to proactively react to situations before they occur. In financial services, in that space, they again are looking at, other than managing risk through robotic process automation utilities, how do they manage data as well from fraudulent activities and so forth? How do they better service the customer through faster robotic processes, through mortgage and loan originations? We've been working with those organisations in that space. In healthcare, at the moment we're working with a major ambulance service provider to look at route optimisation, being able to crowdsource the information on major incidents across the city and providing that information real time to the consumers, to the ambulance services, so they know which route to take to be able to get to the person in need and save lives quicker and faster. These are all the data things we've been doing in that. Another big sector that does use data a lot, and I think it was mentioned a couple of times previously today, is around the humanitarian and social services that we see. Everybody's aware of the Syrian crisis that occurred in 2015. Over 1 billion misplaced people across the world emigrated to Europe. Sweden is one of those countries, for example, that had a huge number of refugees across their borders. They had to deal with over 10,000 people a week, processing 10,000 refugees a week, versus something that they were used to, which was 2.5 immigrants a week. So a huge influx of refugees into Sweden borders came along. They were fortunate. They have applied big data technology and analytics to actually understand, as soon as the crisis occurred, how the movement of refugees was coming to Europe, what numbers to expect, so that when the borders were crossed by the refugees, they were able to provide them with shelter, accommodation, food, and be able to process, have enough staff on the borderlines to be able to process the immigration going forward. Everybody's heard of Haiti earthquake a while ago. That's another really good use case for big data and sharing of data across different organisations, both non-for-profit and private organisations, where they were able to, Karolinska Institute and Digital Mobile Services combined together, and were able to actually track the people impacted by the earthquake from their movements before the earthquake and after the earthquake, and be able to pinpoint the actual medical services at the appropriate time to the right area after that earthquake has occurred. So these are just some of the examples for use of big data, and I believe I'm still on time. I can't see a timekeeper. So, yeah, as I said, they apply across all the industries and all the sectors. And just to leave you with a thought from one of our key leaders, a national leader in the data analytics space, big data is the foundation for any organisation. and is intereffective digital enterprise using artificial intelligence over the times. This is where we're moving to. Artificial intelligence is going to be the next big thing that we are moving into. And the change has to occur. I think my colleague earlier mentioned the cultural change. It's the same in being able to uptake data and being able to use the information the right way. There's still a lot of cultural change that's got to occur in our society, in our organisations, both for profit and for non-profit, to be able to really harness the power of information for the better, okay, not for the worse. I think I'm on time.
Thank you, Katrina. That was great. Just wait for our... Thank you. So how does an organisation start the big data journey?
That's a good question. Look, what you'd usually hear is start small, but that's like in anything in life, you know, baby steps before you actually learn how to actually run and skip and jump. Some of the things that we always, when we talk to different organisations, and we work with a lot of non-for-profit organisations as well, when they do say we want to do big data or analytics, we ask them a simple question: what? Why? Why do you want to do this? What is the use case that you're trying to solve? What's the problem you're trying to solve? That's the first thing. If you don't have a problem that you're trying to solve, the data can help solve, you might not really be in need of a big data solution or being able to do data analytics. Then, you know, once you have decided you really have got a problem and you do want to solve it, we would suggest you do have a look at your organisation, your people, process, data and technology, people being, you know, the culture of your organisation, how willing are they to change, and the education and the things you need to bring them up into the world to be able to use this information once it's delivered to them. And then obviously, do you have the right data? Have a look at that. And data is really the least of your problems. It's just being able to pull it together and use it.
Great, thank you. There certainly is a lot of data out there. It's about what is important to measure, and that's what you measure and get data on, isn't it? So what are the key success factors for a big data program?
Well, we do like to sometimes challenge the norm, and what we find where many organisations, both private and not-for-profit organisations, have in common is the leadership, having the right leadership, the right sponsorship, the transformation that they want to make using that data is one of the key success factors. And along with that is having the right organisational design and governance. And when I talk about governance, I'll talk a bit more later, I talk about looking after your data, being aware and understanding what the data means, who can use it, how you can use it, how you can share it. And when you have those factors in mind, you'd use that. The other big thing that's really important is to be a successful big data program, you need to be able to enable trusted data for your organisation, to have trust in the data they're using, that which comes from governance a lot of the time, and also integrated data ecosystem. There's no point of collecting all this big data if you're not going to integrate it and if you're not going to be able to assemble it for people to use in an appropriate manner.
Great, thank you. Can we govern big data, and should we?
That's another interesting topic in industry. A lot of technologists will tell you, oh no, just bring the data in and it'll govern itself. But to be fair and honest, it's more important now than ever to govern data, especially this type of data, social media data, machine data. And the reasons being why it is so important, we have an obligation, the whole world and organisations alike, social and ethical obligations to ensure that the information that we're collecting about individuals, both about the usage, i.e. how many times they open the fridge, as well as my social or medical history, we need to look after that data and how we use it. And the only way you can do that is through having established appropriate governance within your organisation, who's going to be able to classify the data, be able to share how you use it and how you share it.
Fantastic, thank you. Can you please join me in thanking Katrina? Thank you.
I'd like us all to thank our four speakers who've given us a rapid-fire tour through their areas of influence: Marc, Gilbert, Sandra and Katrina. Given the nature of these talks, we would normally have all the speakers come back up to receive their presents, but we've decided in the interests of logistics that we'll make sure that our thank you gifts are presented to you once the session is over. Just a couple of things before we leave the stage and leave you with Marc for some closing remarks and some information on the Campaign for Australian Aid. First of all, the ACFID, the hashtag ACFID 2017 has been trending across Australia all afternoon. It was much stronger earlier in the day when you were all talking amongst your Twitter friends about everything you were learning, but great to see such interest all over the country in what you've been tweeting out today, so thank you for that. I thought in light of how quickly Katrina had to deal with big data, you might find it interesting to listen to the podcasts of Dr. Genevieve Bell, who gave the Boyer lectures for the ABC. She gave the final lecture 2 Saturdays ago. They're only 27 minutes each for the podcast, and I'd really recommend you listen to them in the series in which she gave them. So there are 4, culminating in a live broadcast that was on the ABC on Radio National about a week ago. But Genevieve Bell on the ABC Radio National podcast, in terms of a gallop through the history of what's happening with technology and humanity within technology. Genevieve is the daughter of an anthropologist, and she grew up in remote Indigenous communities with her anthropologist mother before pursuing her education and moving to Silicon Valley, where she spent 20 years as a cultural driver of the human in the work that Intel did over 20 years in the Valley. So her take on what's happening is a really interesting one, and rounds out, I think, what we've tried to give you this afternoon as a quick run through the KPMG big data work. But what she says, what Genevieve Bell says, is that it's time for Australia to put some Australian values around our data, and that the way we code, the way we think about the collection of our data does require an intervention by people who understand what it means to have human values in our big technology systems. She's now at the ANU running a humanity and big data, big IT programs under the leadership of the Vice-Chancellor there. So I'd really encourage you all to have a look at that and think about that in the context of your own organisations. That's it for the rapid fire discussions this afternoon. So as the panellists leave, I'll invite Marc Purcell to rejoin us and to make final remarks for the day. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Sam. We've got 3 fine young leaders here. I just wanted to introduce Tony Milne, who's from the Campaign for Australian Aid, just to stand up to introduce Tony, who is at a booth with colleagues out in the front, but Tony's the campaign director for the campaign, so I just wanted all of you to acknowledge the team's very hard work on keeping social media active, on the Horn of Africa crisis and Yemen and so on, and all the great work you do, Tony. Round of applause for Tony. And to talk about the Campaign for Australian Aid, 2 leaders, Sashenka Warsman, who's just been elected to the board of ACFID but is the CEO of Oaktree, and Matt Tinkler, who's Deputy CEO at Save the Children. Please come up. Matt has been doing brilliant work behind the scenes with parliamentarians. He moved very quickly on the back of some of that international philanthropy, which has been taking politicians to different countries around the world to see NGO projects, but including Rakhine State earlier this year. And Matt was able to convene those politicians at the federal parliament very quickly to organise briefings on the current humanitarian crisis there. So I just wanted to acknowledge Matt's leadership amongst many who are responding. But over to you, to Matt and Sashenka.
Thanks, Marc. As Marc said, my name is Matt Tinkler. I work for Save the Children, but today I'm here to talk to you in my capacity as a member of the Executive Committee for the Campaign for Australian Aid.
And I'm Sashenka Warsman. I'm the CEO of Oaktree, Australia's largest youth-run organisation, and I'm also here speaking in my capacity as an Executive Committee member of the Campaign for Australian Aid.
I feel like this is the conference equivalent of a meat raffle. We're standing between you and a drink, and we're about to ask you to put your hands in your pocket. So we're going to try and do this in 7 minutes or less.
I've told Matt we'll try for 6, so let's see how far we can go, huh? So let's go. We live in a world right now with overwhelming crises, from climate change and war to human displacement and poverty. It seems like an uphill battle. However, we know that these are simply the symptoms of injustices in communities across the world. And every single one of us here today seeks to right the wrongs we witness.
We live in a world where over 600,000 people, that's 3 times the size of my hometown of Geelong, have fled from Rakhine State in Myanmar with literally just the clothes on their back in the last 2 months alone. It's a world where the scale and nature of crises are pretty hard to comprehend for the average person. And it's a world where I believe, based on the testimonies I heard in Cox's Bazar a couple of weeks ago, it will emerge one day that the number of people killed in Rakhine State are in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. I believe this is our Rwanda. It's happening now on our watch during the moment of this generation. And one day, I think when it will emerge that those things are fact, we will look back on these moments and ask ourselves, did we do enough?
Right now, due to conflict and climate change, over 20 million people are facing famine or near famine situations in South Sudan, Nigeria and Yemen. It might sound like the same old problem on repeat, but the UN now calls it the greatest humanitarian crisis since World War II.
And we know it's these issues of hunger, conflict and inequality that has driven the world's largest number of displaced people since World War II, some 65 million or more people. Now, I suspect nearly every person in this room knows those figures, but we need to ask ourselves, is anyone else listening?
I mean, think about it, right? Climate change is having significant impacts here in Australia and across the world. Our close neighbours in the Pacific are facing devastating impacts. Homes are destroyed due to severe and unpredictable and worsening impacts of climate change. Livelihoods are under threat due to salination, and rising sea levels are threatening entire populations. Having been to Tuvalu myself, the first country to go underwater due to rising sea levels, it's astonishingly clear that people living in the poorest parts of this world will be hit first, and they will be disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate damage.
In short, and if it wasn't already obvious, the world needs our help more than ever. And when we've worked together collectively, we've had some significant wins. We've leveraged moments when the world just couldn't look away. Like when it took the image of a boy named Alan Kurdi on a beach, who could have been my boy, or your nephew, or your brother, to pierce the veil of political apathy and spark action. We took out full-page newspaper ads, we coordinated candlelight vigils, we spoke at rallies attended by tens of thousands of people in our capital cities. And as a result, the government at the time, and Tony Abbott as leader, announced an additional 12,000 Syrians would be resettled and welcomed home here in Australia.
And in 2016's budget and election, the Campaign for Australian Aid led the sector's stop the clock tactic. This helped drive a promise of another 800 million more funding to aid from the ALP over the forward estimates compared to the coalition, and promises of another 0.7% of GNI from the Nick Xenophon team, the Greens and independent Andrew Wilkie.
In recent weeks, many of our agencies have come together to work on, if not a joint appeal mechanism, a cross-promoted and coordinated set of appeals to generate public support and income for the Rohingya crisis. And the government has stepped up to the plate and will match fund some of those appeals. It seems like that with the right carrot and perhaps stick, the much talked about joint appeal mechanism may eventually turn from what has become an impossibility into an inevitability.
Then the Campaign for Australian Aid rallied over 35,000 people to sign the famine petition. With phone calls, emails and visits to over 30 MPs, the government announced an additional funding package of over 30 million on top of the 30 million announced on the 1st of March. This brought the total of this year to almost $90 million, which is close to Australia's fair share.
Our message to you is, we are campaign ready. We have evidence-based messages that have been dual-tested by over 1,500 Australians through 6 focus groups in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. We have a message that we know will enthuse our core supporters and persuade the middle ground. We need to demonstrate that there is political capital to be won and lost on the aid program. We need to demonstrate that aid matters.
Now, with over 130,000 supporters and 20,000 social media followers, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of supporters from each individual agency, we are bigger and stronger than ever. The thing is, we no longer have the seed funding from the Gates Foundation, but this can't be an excuse because we can't afford to lose the undeniable momentum that is building. We know it's a difficult political environment here in Australia and globally, but we have to try. We can't go into another parliament on the back foot on aid, not simply because Australia needs to do its fair share, but because it is far too important for us not to give it our all.
We need to act together to create change. We've got a sophisticated political strategy informed by some of Australia's sharpest political minds. We've got a growing grassroots army that's utilising the latest community organising techniques. We've got cutting-edge digital campaigning that can reach millions of people on social media. We'll conduct electorate polling to help drive election media. We'll raise billboards in target electorates targeting those MPs we need to influence to create change.
But we can't do it without you. If you're not already part of the Campaign for Australian Aid, join as a financial member. We are creating a special election year fighting fund to help us win an aid budget that grows by the hundreds of millions of dollars each year, so we can create the impact and change we know is possible. So join us.
So if you're a member of an aid organisation here today, and I know as someone who manages budgets in those organisations, that there's always a line squirreled away somewhere that you can dedicate to this kind of cause. So you've earned a drink today, go out and enjoy one, but while you're out there, go and visit Tony or see Sash and myself, visit the Campaign for Australian Aid booth and join us in supporting this important campaign.